All right. The Enlightenment. The people who founded the Enlightenment, they were Europeans, and they believed that it would take an enlightened ruler to bring about what they believed to be natural laws. That the natural way of doing things was according to the principles of Enlightenment. Each of you can decide for yourself. I mean, a lot of what they taught we take for granted here in America, but it was not always that way. Now, we'll talk first about three rulers who tried to give lip service, at least to the Enlightenment. Frederick of Prussia, Joseph of Austria, and Catherine the Great of Russia. Two of them have the title of the Great. In every case, they would give lip service to the Enlightenment, but really they were not enthused about it. Now, here's a point. If you get nothing else from this lesson, I want you to get this. Change is very difficult to implement. Extremely so. And what most people do not understand is when you make one change, you always create another problem. Now, let's say you get sick and you go to a doctor and he prescribes a medicine. Sometimes the medicine makes you sicker than the ailment you had to begin with. Maybe most of you young people don't know what I'm talking about yet, but later on you will. Chemotherapy is very, very horrible to the persons who have to take it. But and more they're getting to where it cures more and more cancers. But it's not pleasant to take. But again, medicines, basically what these people were asking their rulers to do was apply medicine to cure what they perceived to be ills. We'll start with Frederick. Now this is Prussia, not Russia. He invited the philosopher Voltaire to live in his court. Voltaire moved from France to Frederick's court, and Voltaire lived there for several years. Now Frederick was not a religious man himself, so he had little trouble granting religious toleration. But the Enlightenment called for serfs being freed. Frederick the Great refused to free the serfs because it would offend the nobility. And keep in mind, he had to rule through the nobles. You might ask why. Well, the telephone had not been invented, the telegraph had not been invented, the airplane had not been invented. Now, when Hitler came on the scene and ruled Germany many generations later, Hitler had the telephone, the telegraph, the radio, the airplane, the train, the big truck, the automobile, and he could rule more without his nobility. But before these inventions were made, they had to rule through nobles. Now, folk, I say this, but I'll probably repeat it again when we come to Hitler. It is frightening to think what a tyrant could do today when we have the internet and we have computers. And Big Brother can look over your shoulder and know where every one of us are at every minute of every day. And it's frightening to think how much authority could be had. Hitler boasted, no man will probably ever have more authority than I have. But Frederick had to rule through his nobles, as all rulers during his day had to rule, as all rulers for thousands of years had to rule. They had to rule a big empire through the nobles. So he wouldn't free the serfs because the nobles would be offended. Now, what was a serf? A serf is, for all practical purposes, a slave except for one thing. A serf cannot be bought or sold. That's the difference. Slaves could be bought or sold. Slavery had been outlawed in Europe. Serfdom was where the serfs were bound to the nobles, but they couldn't be sold from one nobleman to another. So that was a difference. So the Enlightenment called for the freedom and freeing of serfs. A lot of them couldn't. All right, I'll save Joseph second to last. Going on to Russia, she invited the philosopher Diderot to live in her court, and Diderot did not like Russian climate at all. The Russian winters are very, very cold. The Russian summers are short. Under her, again, she emphasized the practical. She would listen to Diderot, but she would do her own thing. Serfdom was actually expanded. As for religious toleration, she protected the Greek Orthodox in Muslim countries. In other words, Muslims were accused of persecuting Greek Orthodox, so she would protect the Greek Orthodox in Muslim countries. She did not in any way adhere to the principles of the Enlightenment, even though she pretended to do so by having an Enlightenment philosopher in her court. But that was as far as it went. Now we come to the sad story of a man who actually tried. Austria's leader, Joseph II. He abolished serfdom, he granted religious tolerance, and he made everybody angry at him. Why? The nobility didn't like it because all of a sudden they lost a lot of their cheap labor. As for religious tolerance, he offended the main denomination of his realm, the Catholics. So the Catholic Church turned against him because they wanted Austria to become exclusively Catholic. And on his tombstone he wrote, "Here lies Joseph II, who failed in everything he attempted." I mean, he felt like a failure. He tried. I mean, everything he did, today, as 21st century American, I believe most of us are Americans, maybe not all, but most of us who are American would agree with. But the people of his day, even the serfs turned against him. All right, you might say, what? Because the serfs had lived the way they were living for maybe about 1,000 years. Their ancestors lived as serfs. Then all of a sudden they didn't have an overlord anymore, a master, and they wondered, hey, you know, what do we do? And it basically put them on their own, landless and jobless. So even they turned against him. All right. Now, I've got to jump to something I heard in my car already on the way in. There are two types of reforms the 21st century Americans are thinking about making. One, abolish all college debt. Number two is set forth a $15 an hour minimum wage. Most of you young people would probably agree with all that. I mean, abolish college debt, set forth a minimum wage of $15 an hour. It would put the little man out of business, folk. What you realize, you reform in one area, you create new problems. And a lot of people, I mean, who I've taught lately, seem to think the federal government is a bottomless well that has an unending supply of money. There'd be more than $1 trillion if the government loses if the college students default on their loans or don't pay their loans. More than $1 trillion, and that money will be borrowed money. That'll put us more than $1 trillion deeper in debt. How much more can you go? All right, if any of you feel differently, your input is welcome. I know most of you are young.
I agree with you.
What's that? You agree?
I agree with you.
Thank
I
you.
don't think that's effective.
Well, the small businessman, will be put out of business. And then that means a whole lot of persons your age will be put out of work.
I don't think a lot of labor is worth $15. I think some jobs are not. That's pretty
There's entry-level jobs. I mean,
Right.
You start off at the bottom, and then if you do a good job at the bottom, you work your way up to the bottom. I mean, I did not hire at Lockheed until I was 30.
Right.
But in the meantime, I worked at some lower-level job. Yes.
I do believe in a livable wage, though.
Yes.
You know what?
And I do believe in a livable wage.
Livable
a livable
wage,
wage.
yeah. But
Because rents go up in certain socioeconomic impoverished areas. It's steady climbing up. Things are steady climbing up, but this is not going up. And what's happening is there are many people that are having a very difficult time to make ends meet. And so I don't know what a livable wage is. I cannot say what that is. I don't know what it is.
It changes every year. I lost count.
But that's what I strongly
Actually,
feel.
the minimum wage is different in every state anymore. It used to be the state of federal government. One time it was, when it first started, I believe it was about 75 cents an hour. Then when I was a kid, it was $1 an hour. Eventually, under Kennedy, it went up to $1.25, then $1.75, and that seems like little.
Well, my first job in 1978 was $3.35 an hour. But I worked at a bank in high school.
Oh.
It was $3.35.
Well, I mean, I remember when my mother told me she'd gotten a letter from my uncle. Uncle living in Tennessee. She said, Uncle Oris, he's deceased now, got a job. He's making $3.40 an hour. And oh man, he thought that was outstanding. I mean, this was in 1958, you see. $3.40 an hour, and the minimum wage was only $1 an hour. I mean, Lockheed wasn't even paying its workers that much back then. I mean, but times change, and anyway. All right, but anyway, the point I'm making is, change is very, very difficult to make, and it oftentimes comes at a terrible expense. Now, we're going to go to another country where that they did try to force changes. That country was France. Now, I touched on this last time, but in the case of the French, they had a few years of prosperity. Then King Louis XVI, and folks, this is kind of sad, King Louis XVI decided to help the 13 American colonies defeat the British, but that broke up his finances. I mean, it cost him a lot of money to send a bunch of ships and a bunch of soldiers 4,000 miles across the ocean. It helped us. I mean, you know, hey, we won the war. Probably couldn't have done it without French help. But it put Louis XVI in debt, and it became obvious he couldn't pay. So he did something that turned out to be fatal. He called the Estates General, I'm not going to write that down, but he called the estate, which had not met in 130 years. During the reigns of Louis XIV, Louis XV, they would not rule through the Estates General. But he called the Estates General because the Estates General had the power to levy a tax. Well, taxes were already too heavy. The Estates General wound up chopping Louis XVI's head off, him and his wife both. But he did not know that at the time. Actually, a book says that it had not met in about 150 years. Well, they needed reform. Well, to make a long story short, the French Revolution eventually outlawed all religion, sent the church took over all church lands, converted the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which recently made news because of the burning of fire, converted the Cathedral of Notre Dame to a house of reason, started, you might say, worshiping a god called the God of Reason. Then someone invented, they outlawed flogging. That was part of the Enlightenment. They outlawed flogging, but then in its place, they invented the guillotine, which supposedly was a more humane method of execution. Basically, the guillotine was where a heavy blade came down on your neck and took your head off. And then they started using it just like crazy. And the people around the French said, I wonder if this doesn't mean the end of everything that's good and right. Well, some philosopher predicted that out of the French Revolution, they would not get what they wanted. And they sure enough didn't. Now again, because behind, I won't go into detail, I used to show a video about this. The French, the Committee of Public Safety, that was a committee that executed 5,000 people, for some of them for just simply not supporting the revolution enough. But as France began to get more enemies on all sides, after all, Queen Marie Antoinette was an Austrian. She was the daughter of the Austrian queen. And so that got Austria against them. Then Great Britain turned against them. So France decided that they would go all out in their wars, and they got together an army that consisted of every able male person. Nobody was exempt. And this was the beginning of what was to become total all-out war. You might ask, what was war before? Before this time, war was made up of a few professional soldiers. Kings would hire soldiers, and these soldiers would go out and fight. But now they said being a soldier is everybody's patriotic duty, and France mobilized. And this was to enable France to win a lot of its wars later. France was able to take on its enemies on all sides. But they even changed the calendar for a while. starting with year 1 would be the year that the revolution began. And as was the case of all dictators that were to come later, every dictator who abuses people says, once I get control, once we get things settled down, the abuse will stop. The French did the same thing. Well, the revolution ended, as some philosopher predicted, it ended with one man taking charge. That man's name was Napoleon. Oh, here it is. Napoleon. Now, Napoleon goes down in history as a great general, but if you look at his record, he had been sent to the Middle East and he had lost badly, and finally had just deserted his army and come back to France. And then once he'd come back to France, he saw the opportunity and came in and took over. There is a story going around that he, like Hitler and like Woodrow Wilson and others, that he was simply put up as a puppet by persons who believed that once in power they could control him. That he was a little man and he was very unattractive, very unassuming. But nevertheless, once in power, he ran the show and he took charge and would not be told what to do by his advisors. Well, one of the first things he did was to allow the church back in. But the church didn't like it because the French church at this time was exclusively Catholic, owing to the fact that they'd had 180 or so years of persecuting Protestants. So only Catholic. But Napoleon said to the church, you may not persecute anyone anymore. We're going to allow religious toleration. All right. Then, instead of going to the Pope to be crowned emperor, like all emperors do, he asked the Pope to come to him and crown him in his own capital. The Pope's friends urged him, well, you shouldn't go. I mean, he's supposed to come to you. But the Pope said, well, wait, France has just recently opened the door and let the church back in, and I want to make a presence in France to let the French people know that the church is welcome. So the Pope went. Now, some people say this story is true and some don't. According to the story, he was kneeling, and well, actually he wouldn't kneel, he stood. When the Pope started to crown him, he reached over, snatched the crown out of the Pope's hand, and crowned himself. Then when the Pope started to crown his wife, Josephine, he reached over, snatched the crown of the Pope's hand, he crowned Josephine himself. Basically letting the world know, I'm in charge. Also, he had his grave arranged. When you go to his tomb, in order to see his tomb, you're elevated, you have to bow your head to see his tomb. I mean, this man had a real problem with ego, to say the least. But he took over and he brought peace and order to France. He ended the reign of terror. One of the things he did for the United States was he needed money, so he sold the Louisiana Purchase to the United States for something like $15 million, or 2 pennies an acre. Again, inflation, you know, thing. But the Louisiana Purchase gave the United States claim to all the territory from Louisiana, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and on up, like Montana, and even Oregon and Washington. Oregon and Washington. So he sold the United States a whole lot of territory because he needed money. And because of France's new habit of drafting everyone in the army, even people who really could not fight, they said, well, there's something you can do. He went on a program of conquest. And he conquered much of Europe.
Sorry, I missed that. You said you went on a conquest.
Okay, he went on a program of conquest because he had the largest army in all of Europe at the time.
It wasn't financial based?
Well, actually, a lot of it did involve finances. So as we get to, for instance, well, okay, I'll jump to this part. When he defeated Russia, he negotiated with the Tsar of Russia that had set up a continental system in Europe that would involve a whole lot of trade. Okay, yes.
Where was Napoleon from?
Napoleon was French.
Okay,
You can keep him in mind because he was a very important figure in this part of history. Anyway, he conquered Holland. He engaged in wars with Spain. He could not quite conquer Spain because the British sent a general to Spain named Wellington. Now, Wellington was to defeat Napoleon in his final battle. But anyway, Wellington was defeating Napoleon's best generals. Napoleon once looked to the report, Wellington has defeated General such and such, and Napoleon, who the devil is Wellington? He was to eventually find out. But anyway, now, while Spain was busy fighting off the French, Napoleon's French armies, the Latin American countries that Spain owned took this opportunity to rebel. And in Latin America, a man named Simon Bolivar, we'll talk about him hopefully before the class is over. It's a man named Simon Bolivar freed a whole lot of Latin American countries from Spain, including Argentina, Chile, Bolivia. Bolivia is named after Bolivar. Colombia, Ecuador, Peru. Those countries all were freed, and Spain could do nothing about it because Spain had to spend its time fighting off the French. So Spain could not, Spain did fight, Spain did send armies, but Latin America rebelled all at once, and Latin America was too big for the Spanish to handle. And Mexico also got its independence at this time. Again, got its independence from Spain. Anyway, Napoleon would conquer by number one, being faster than the enemy. That meant when you're faster than the enemy, that meant if you don't want to fight, you don't have to. But another was using tactics of getting around the enemy's flank. Now, all right, you're in a battle. As long as the enemy is in front of you, you can fight. But when troops realize the enemy has gotten around behind them, most troops will break ranks and run. It's a natural instinct. Hey, I can fight them while they're in front of you. When they're behind, whoops, you know, which ones of us are going to turn around and hit them from behind? Because your training calls for, in those days, calls for keeping the enemy in front of you. Napoleon would outflank them. The American general Stonewall Jackson studied Napoleon extensively and copied him. And Jackson won battle after battle again by getting around the enemy's flank, being faster than the enemy, forcing his troops to march back. Three men, Oliver Cromwell, Napoleon, and Stonewall Jackson, used tactics. Jackson copied both men. In fact, Jackson went to Europe and visited Napoleon's battlefields and saw where that such and such happened here. Napoleon also said that there's a certain 10 or 15 minutes in a battle that's going to determine whether you win. The issue is not the number of troops you have. The issue is position. Position. If you get the position, you're going to win. And said if you don't get in the right position at the right time, during that 15 minutes of critical in a battle, you're going to lose even if you have the most men, the most artillery, the most ammunition, and the best troops. You're going to lose. It's a matter of positioning. But anyway, Napoleon wound up winning some 40 victories. His fortunes turned, though, one day. He dazzled the Tsar of Russia with the idea of, Tsar Alexander I, with the idea of setting up a continental system. The purpose of the continental system was to economically isolate Great Britain. Now, this thing about economic isolation is nothing new. Today, this very day, economic isolation makes news as our government tries to isolate Iran. Well, Napoleon tried to economically isolate Britain, and keep in mind, Britain was an island. That meant Britain depended on sea trade. Napoleon said, you know, if we just keep the trade within our continent here, we can isolate Britain. The Tsar thought it was a good idea, until one day Napoleon sent him a letter to the Tsar, close your Baltic ports. All right, Russia is a big, big country with a large, large sea coast, but it's mostly landlocked. Because most of its sea coast stays frozen, so the only warm water port The only warm-water port that Russia had was on the Baltic, and the Tsar said no. Napoleon mobilized a huge army to punish the Tsar. I've mentioned already what happened. And if somebody drew a graph that's I've seen, I mean a little picture I've seen here, how that Napoleon's army started out this big and kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. It wasn't bullets that took them out as much as it was disease. But then he got to Russia itself. And the cold Russian winter. When he got to Russia, the Russians poisoned the wells, burned all the buildings, moved all their equipment farther inland, and keep in mind, Russia is huge. Napoleon, unlike Hitler, Napoleon actually got inside Moscow, which the Russians proceeded to burn his troops. And finally, Napoleon, I'd better get out of Russia while I'm still alive, because they're equipping my armies right and left. So Napoleon left Russia, and as he left, more and more of his troops died. Again, disease took him. There have been 3 times in the history of Russia in modern times where the Russian winter has destroyed an invading army. Charles XII of Sweden went to Russia, his was destroyed, Napoleon, and then later, last of all, Hitler. Hitler went to Russia, and the Russian winter froze out his army also. Napoleon got back home, and for the French, multiplied millions of their young men had been killed, or maybe multiplied hundreds of thousands, not maybe hundreds of thousands of young men had been killed. The people of France overthrew Napoleon, restored Louis XVIII to the throne. Louis XVIII was a brother of Louis XVI. They put Louis XVIII on the throne and put Napoleon on the island, so one of those islands south of France, Corsica, I believe. It might have been anyway, one of the islands. Napoleon escaped. He was a slick one. Went back and took over. The people of France did not like Louis XVIII. Louis XVIII did not like Louis XVIII. Napoleon took over, gathered his army together. The British met him at a place called Waterloo. At the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon, it's believed, would have won it. But one of his generals did not show up. This general, General Grouchy, don't worry about the name. General Grouchy was following orders, and he was supposed to pursue a certain general. The General Grouchy was pursuing was already at the Waterloo field. General Grouchy could hear the cannon off to his left as he pursued the Prussian general, who was already, like I say, it was like pursuing the wind. General Grouchy refused to change his orders and go where the sound of the battle was. And General Grouchy never showed up. Napoleon finally fled the battlefield. When he did, his entire army fled with him, of course. Napoleon later said, Waterloo's going to wipe out the memory of my 40 victories. Now, Napoleon did win 40 victories, but he had a few losses, particularly in Russia and at Waterloo. Also, Napoleon's tactics got to be too well known. And generals got to where they could figure him out after a while. Now, Napoleon lived while he was in power after George Washington's presidency was over. Their lives overlapped. Napoleon and Washington had heard of each other. If you look at Washington's war record, Washington as general won 4 battles and lost 13. That doesn't sound like an impressive record, but George Washington won his last battle. Napoleon cannot say the same thing. It's that final victory that counts. Washington won his last, Napoleon lost his last. Napoleon was taken on a ship and put on the island of St. Helena, where he died. And this from St. Helena, he could not escape. I mean, that was halfway around the world and on the opposite side of the equator. I mean, it's then far out in the ocean, big ocean. And there it was not like escaping from one of those French islands. I mean, he was in exile. And he only lived to be a little bit more than 40 years old. Now, you see a famous pose when I give a lecture on the poet, I make sure I'm wearing a button-down shirt. This is a famous pose. Now, I was asked one time, why do the paintings of old people always show them, or never show them smiling? Does anyone know?
Take forever.
The paintings took days to do, and you just can't hold a smile for hours on end while you pose. So most of them, they would sit there and get kind of bored after a while, just while they sat while the artists paint them. Also, it's believed that Napoleon had stomach issues. He died of stomach cancer. And the stomach issues were brought about by eating food with a whole